But the small boat, rocking on the waves, carried a new scent. An accidental cut on the young man's arm as he handled a fishing hook had begun to bleed, a scarlet trickle seeping over the edge. The shark, which had previously ignored the easy prey, smelled the fresh blood, the scent of active life, of energy in motion. In an instant that defied logic and gravity, the white and grey mass erupted from the water with astonishing speed. It was not an attack against the elderly woman, but an explosion of instinct directed at the source of life and movement. A sharp scream tore through the air as the powerful jaws clamped down on the villain's outstretched arm. The boat rocked violently, and when the beast plunged back into the depths, taking with it what it had torn away, the rich young man stood there in shock, his mutilated arm bleeding profusely, pain and terror finally invading his empty heart. Nature indeed had taken care of everything, but not in the way he expected. The grandmother, still adrift, watched the boat move away, the stillness of the sea now a silent testament to a wild and relentless justice. The young man's scream of terror echoed across the vast blue, a raw animalistic sound that was lost in the immensity of the ocean. It was not the cry of a predator, but that of prey. His mutilated arm, now a bloody and disfigured stump, pulsed with excruciating pain that erupted through his initial shock. Blood gushed, painting the boat's deck with a dark red that mixed with the splashing salt water. The world, once under his arrogant control, collapsed into a whirlwind of agony and panic. He fell to his knees, his body trembling uncontrollably. The sight of his own blood, the exposed flesh, the absence of a limb that had always been there, was too much for his pampered mind to process. The shark, the same one he had hoped would devour his grandmother, had taken a piece of him, a vital piece. The irony was a poison even more bitter than the sea salt. The boat, without a conscious pilot, continued to drift away, propelled by the currents and the faint wind. The grandmother, still bound, floated on the surface, a small and fragile figure, but now with an aura of silent, implacable witness. Her eyes, once filled with pleading, now watched the scene with an almost supernatural coldness. She saw the blood on the deck, her grandson's despair, the scarlet stains spreading in the water around the boat. Justice, she thought, had sharp teeth. The young man, amidst the fog of pain and terror, tried to react. His other arm, what remained, fumbled frantically for something, anything, to staunch the bleeding. The torn fabric of his shirt was his first instinct, but the pressure was weak, ineffective. Blood continued to flow, each heartbeat pumping more life out of his body. Dizziness began to set in, a menacing darkness at the edges of his vision. He needed help, but he was alone, miles from any civilization, at the mercy of an ocean that had just exacted a terrible price. The water around the boat, once turquoise, now had red veins spreading slowly. The smell of blood, once a mere trace for the shark, was now a dense cloud, an open invitation to any predator in the depths. The young man looked at the water, panic growing. What if the shark came back? What if others came? He was the bait now. He was the prey. The grandmother, meanwhile, felt the current drag her. The pain of the ropes tightening around her wrists and ankles was constant, but adrenaline and shock kept her alert. She had no way to move, no way to free herself. Her only option was to float, watch, and wait. The sun scorched her skin, the salt stung her cracked lips, but she did not take her eyes off the receding boat. Her grandson, once so powerful and cruel, was now a pathetic figure, writhing in his own hell. The young man finally found an old towel at the bottom of the boat, a forgotten item from a leisure day that now became his only hope. With difficulty and searing pain, he wrapped it tightly around the stump, pressing with his remaining hand. The effort left him exhausted, his vision darkening further. He fell onto his back on the deck, gasping. his heart beating erratically. The towel was soaked in seconds, but the flow seemed to diminish slightly. However, the calm was illusory. The bloodstain in the water continued to expand, a scarlet flag under the merciless sun. And then, a shadow. Not that of the great white shark that had attacked him, but a different silhouette, more slender, faster. A school of blue sharks, drawn by the promise of an easy feast, began to circle in the depths, their cold, empty eyes fixed on the source of the banquet. The young man, barely able to maintain consciousness, did not see them. But the grandmother, still adrift, did. She saw the shadows multiply, the furtive movements beneath the surface. The ocean had not finished collecting its price, and for her the waiting continued. The thin line between life and death, between vengeance and survival, growing ever thinner. The soaked towel on the young man's arm stump was a lie, a pathetic illusion of safety. The blood, though perhaps flowing a little less profusely, continued to pulse, a red tide that stubbornly seeped, staining the boat's canvas with a dark crimson. Each heartbeat was a cruel reminder of the life draining away, of the energy abandoning him. The dizziness, once a shadow at the edges of his vision, was now a thick fog, a veil that threatened to engulf him completely. The world spun, the merciless sun danced on his retina, and the sound of the waves, once a distant murmur, transformed into a deafening hum in his ears. He lay on his back, gasping, his body trembling in uncontrollable spasms. The panic, which had once been a scream, was now a cold whisper, a chilling certainty that he was doomed. His eyes, hazy and dilated, fixed on the blue sky, but saw only the approaching darkness. The pain was a living entity, gnawing at his flesh, consuming his sanity. The luxury of his past life, the parties, the fast cars, the easy women, all seemed like a cruel joke now, a distant, unreal dream in the face of the ocean's brutality. He was a dethroned king, a fallen god, and his kingdom was now a drifting boat, his throne a bloody deck. The grandmother, meanwhile, continued to float, a small island of flesh and bone in the blue immensity. The ropes tightened, cutting into her skin, but the physical pain was a mere nuisance compared to the intensity of the spectacle unfolding before her eyes. She watched the boat drift away, a red stain spreading in its wake. Her eyes, once pleading, now carried the weight of an ancestral wisdom, the coldness of one who witnesses nature's retribution. She felt no joy, no triumph, only a somber resignation to the inevitable. The ocean, she thought, always collects its debts, and the price was always high. Below the surface, the dance of death began to intensify. The slender shadows of the blue sharks multiplied, their movements furtive and coordinated, a silent and relentless patrol. They were not the brute, solitary force of the great white, but a pack, a collective threat approaching with deadly patience. Their eyes, like cold pearls, were fixed on the expanding bloodstain, a beacon of life in peril. They needed no bait. The young man's very life was the most potent lure. One of the sharks, bolder, made a tighter circle, its dorsal fin cutting the water's surface a few feet from the boat. The young man, in his stupor of pain, did not see it, but the grandmother did. She saw the fin, the promise of sharp teeth, the inevitability of the end. The current, slow but steady, continued to drag her away from the boat, but not from the spectacle. She was a captive spectator, bound by her own helplessness, but with a clear vision of justice unfolding. The boat, rudderless, rocked with the waves, an empty shell adrift. The sun continued to beat down. Dehydration began to take its toll, and the smell of blood in the air was now an irresistible invitation for predators. The young man tried to stand, a hoarse groan escaping his cracked lips. His body, heavy and weak, refused to obey. He fumbled on the deck with his remaining hand, seeking a point of support, a hope. But there was nothing but salt, blood, and solitude. As he struggled against the darkness that engulfed him, one of the blue sharks, driven by the strong scent and the prey's inactivity, made a bolder move. Its head briefly emerged from the water, its empty eyes fixed on the boat, its mouth agape, revealing rows of serrated teeth. It was not a full attack, but a test, a probing, a confirmation that the prey was weak, vulnerable. The young man, for an instant, managed to focus. He saw the shadow, the fin, the promise of more pain. A scream of terror, now more a lament than a challenge, tore from his throat. Renewed panic injected a dose of adrenaline into his veins, a last desperate effort. He tried to drag himself to the bow, away from the edge where the blood was flowing, but his muscles were weak, his mind confused. Every movement was agony, every inch covered, an eternity. The towel on his arm stump was completely soaked, slippery, useless. The flow of life continued, unyielding. Suddenly, a more abrupt movement. One of the blue sharks, larger than the others, collided with the boat's hull, not with the intention to bite, but to test its stability, to feel the prey. The impact made the boat rock violently, throwing the young man to the side. His head hit the deck with a dull thud, and for a moment darkness completely engulfed him. The searing pain of the injured arm was replaced by a cold void. He was on the edge of the abyss, consciousness flickering like a candle about to go out. When his eyes opened again, his vision was even blurrier, but he managed to distinguish something that chilled him to the bone. They were not just shadows now. They were entire bodies, slender and grey, rubbing against the boat's hull. Dorsal fins sliced the surface in a silent frenzy, and the metallic smell of his own blood, mixed with sea salt, was an irresistible invitation to the hungry pack. One of the sharks, with growing audacity, emerged higher, its head almost touching the boat's edge. Its eyes, black and emotionless, fixed on the young man, and he could see its mouth opening, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. It was no longer a test. It was preparation for the attack. The young man tried to scream, but only a weak hiss escaped his throat. His remaining arm rose instinctively, a futile gesture of defense. He was defenseless, bleeding, adrift. The grandmother, a few feet away, felt the boat's vibration, the increased agitation in the water. She saw the shark emerge, its mouth open, and the final despair on her grandson's face. A solitary tear traced her parched cheek, not of pity, but of a deep and bitter understanding. The cycle was complete. Nature, in its indifferent brutality, was about to collect the last installment of the debt. The boat rocked again, harder this time, and the water around it boiled with the predator's activity. The young man closed his eyes, awaiting the final impact, the bite that would take him to eternal darkness. The ocean had become his tomb, and the sharks, his gravediggers. He closed his eyes, awaiting the final impact, the bite that would take him to eternal darkness. The ocean had become his tomb, and the sharks, his gravediggers, but the bite did not come. Instead, the boat rocked violently once more, a lateral blow that sent him rolling across the bloody deck. A groan of pain escaped his cracked lips. The darkness was not death, but unconsciousness, his mind refusing to bear any more. For an instant, the world dissolved into a blur of light and shadow, the sound of the waves mingling with a distant hum, a muffled echo of his own panic. When lucidity, fragile and intermittent, returned, he was face down, his face pressed against the deck, damp with blood and salt. The smell was nauseating, metallic and dense, permeating every fiber of his being. He tried to lift his head, but his neck muscles protested, too weak for the task. His eyes, swollen and burning, focused on the water beside the boat. The scene was even more hellish than before. The blue sharks, once mere shadows, were now a wall of grey, agile bodies. They were not just circling, they were rubbing against the hull, pushing, testing the vessel's resistance. Some of them raised their heads above the waterline, their nostrils dilated, sniffing the air with palpable eagerness. It was no longer a probing, it was a siege. They were hungry, and the prey he knew with a chilling certainty was him. Panic, despite the exhaustion consuming his body, reignited in his chest, a cold, desperate flame. He could not move, could not fight. He was just a mass of bleeding flesh, awaiting the inevitable. Images of his past life, the excesses, the arrogance, the empty laughter, all mingled in a distorted kaleidoscope of regret and terror. He saw his grandmother's face, not the aged, bound face watching him now, but the face of a younger woman, holding him in her lap, telling him stories of a time when cruelty was a distant word. Guilt, a slow poison, began to corrode what remained of his sanity. The grandmother, at a distance that seemed to increase with each passing second due to the current, watched. The ropes tightened, cutting into her skin, but she barely felt the physical pain. Her eyes, once fixed on her grandson, now swept the horizon, the blue immensity surrounding her, a canvas for the unfolding tragedy. She saw the agitation of the blue sharks, the frantic dance around the boat, but something else caught her attention. A shadow, deeper, vaster, moving with majestic yet relentless slowness in the depths beneath the smaller sharks. It was him, the great white. The presence of the alpha predator was unmistakable. The blue sharks, once so bold in their siege, began to disperse, their movements now more hesitant, more cautious. They moved away, diving into the depths, making way for the true force of the ocean. The young man, in his stupor, did not perceive the change in dynamics beneath the surface. He was trapped in his own particular hell, his vision blurred, his hearing turning into white noise, a constant hum that isolated him from the outside world. But the grandmother saw. She saw the dorsal fin, a dark and imposing blade, emerge from the water a few feet from the boat, not abruptly, but with an eerie, almost supernatural calm. It was larger than she remembered, more menacing. The great white shark was not there out of curiosity. It was there because the blood, the scent of wounded prey, was an irresistible invitation, a promise of a feast. The boat, already unstable, began to rock more erratically, not from the blue sharks, but from the powerful current created by the giant beast's movement. The young man felt the change, a new kind of vibration, more powerful, more primal, reverberating through his entire body. He opened his eyes again, fighting against the darkness that threatened to engulf him. His vision, for a brief and terrible moment, cleared. He saw the fin, he saw the shadow, and then he saw the head. Emerging from the water with deliberate slowness, the great white shark's head was a nightmare vision, a sculpture of brute force and indifference. Its black, lidless eyes fixed on him, without emotion, without malice, only ancestral hunger, the programming of a perfect predator. Its mouth, slightly agape, revealed rows of triangular teeth, each a promise of dismemberment, of a brutal and inevitable end. It was not a quick, furious attack, but a calculated approach, an assessment of the prey, a cruel game of cat and mouse. The young man tried to scream, but his voice failed, a hoarse, inaudible gasp. The air seemed to have been sucked from his lungs. He was paralyzed, a mouse cornered by a giant cat with no hope of escape. The pain of his amputated arm was now an insignificant detail compared to the terror that consumed him, a terror that chilled him to the bone. He was the bait, the prey, the sacrifice, and the great white, the executioner. The great white shark circled the boat once, its fin cutting the water with surgical precision, a deadly ballet. The blue sharks had disappeared, plunged into the depths, leaving the stage to the king of the ocean. The grandmother watched, her heart pounding, but her expression was still one of resignation, of a somber acceptance. She felt no pity. She felt the coldness of justice, the inevitability of karma. The great white then made a move that was not of hunting but of dominance. It collided with the boat's hull, not with its mouth, but with its massive body, a lateral blow that made the small vessel spin and tilt dangerously. The young man was thrown against the edge, his weak body unable to resist the impact. He felt the cold ocean water flood the deck, mixing with his blood, creating a crimson whirlpool. The boat was sinking. It was not an attack to devour him immediately, but to dismantle his sanctuary, to take him from his precarious refuge. The great white wanted him in the water, in its domain, where the advantage was total. The young man coughed, choking on the salt water that now licked his face, invading his lungs. He tried to cling to something, anything, but his hands slipped on the wet deck, slick with blood and salt. The grandmother saw the boat tilt, water gushing in. She saw the final despair on her grandson's face, the understanding that there was no escape, that the end was imminent. The great white, with a slow and powerful movement, moved away slightly, as if giving space for the boat to sink, for the prey to fall into its deadly embrace. The sentence had been pronounced, and now the execution was underway. The ocean, relentless, was about to claim its final debt. The boat, now an empty shell, no longer struggled. The salt water mixed with blood rose relentlessly, engulfing the deck, the sides, everything. Each wave that hit the hull was no longer a challenge, but an invitation to submersion. The young man, a human rag of pain and panic, felt the vessel's weight give way, the ground beneath him disappearing. His desperate fingers tried to cling to the edges, but the wood was slippery, covered in a viscous film of blood and salt. It was useless. The world spun, and the horizon line tilted dangerously, announcing the final plunge. A last groan escaped his cracked lips as the boat made its final bow. The bow sank first, dragging the rest of the structure into the depths. He was thrown forward, his weak and mutilated body unable to offer any resistance. The impact with the water was a cold shock, a brutal embrace that enveloped him completely. The ocean, his executioner, and his tomb finally had him in its domain. Water invaded his ears, muffling the sound of the waves and his own silent screams. His eyes opened, burning with salt, and he saw a blue-green blur, dotted with air bubbles escaping from the sinking boat. He tried to swim, tried to propel himself to the surface, but his amputated arm was a dead weight, and his entire body seemed to have been drained of all strength. Panic was a current pulling him down, stronger than any shark. He swallowed water, coughed, and the pain in his chest was excruciating. The blood, still gushing from his mutilated shoulder, formed a crimson cloud around him, a deadly aura spreading in the blue immensity. He was the bait now, unbound, boatless, just bleeding flesh adrift. And then he saw it. The shadow. Not one, but the shadow. The great white, which had moved away earlier, now approached with deliberate, almost zen slowness. There was no rush, just the certainty of a predator who knows its prey has nowhere to go. The dorsal fin cut the water's surface a few feet away, a dark and imposing blade, but most of its massive body was submerged, an invisible and overwhelming force. The young man tried to move, but every movement was an agonizing effort. He felt the cold water, the metallic smell of his own blood, and the pure terror that paralyzed him. His eyes, wide open, fixed on the creature. He saw its head emerge slightly, its black, lifeless eyes fixed on him. There was no hatred, no anger, just ancestral hunger, nature's brutal indifference. And the grandmother? The grandmother was still there, a few feet away, floating, motionless. The ropes tightened, but her body seemed to have found a strange peace, an acceptance. She watched her grandson, now in the water, defenseless, at the mercy of the predator. Her eyes, once tearful, were dry now, fixed on the unfolding scene. She saw the great white shark, the terrible majesty of its form, and the cloud of blood that enveloped her grandson. But the shark, with all its attention focused on the wounded prey, seemed to ignore her completely. She was just part of the scenery, an inert rock in the path of the current. The great white then made a move, not an attack, not a bite. It was a glide, a brush. Its massive body passed close to the young man, so close that he felt the water pressure, the roughness of the shark's skin. It was a warning, a display of power, an invitation to the abyss. The young man screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the water, a bubble of despair that rose to the surface and burst in the salty air. He was exhausted. The pain was a fire consuming every nerve, every muscle. Guilt, once a slow poison, was now an acid burning his soul. He saw flashes of his life, the faces he had hurt, the cruel words he had uttered, the image of his grandmother, young and smiling, holding him in her lap, mingled with the image of her. Bound, thrown into the sea, regret was a weight greater than the ocean. The great white circled again, closer this time. The water around the young man began to bubble, not from blue sharks, which had completely disappeared, but from the sheer force of the alpha predator. The young man felt the current, the whirlpool pulling him to the center of the death stage. He knew it was the end. There was no more hope, no more escape. He closed his eyes, awaiting the impact, the final pain, the darkness. But the attack did not come immediately. Instead, he felt a push, an enormous force that turned him onto his back. His eyes opened again, and he saw. Above him, the great white shark's head emerged from the water, not to bite but to observe him. The black eyes were a pit of emptiness, a mirror to his own terror. Its mouth, slightly open, revealed rows of teeth, each a death sentence. The shark was not in a hurry. It seemed to enjoy the spectacle, the agony of its prey. It was playing. The young man felt the tip of the shark's nose brush his leg, a light, almost gentle touch. But it made him scream again, a muffled, inaudible sound. It was the final torture, the ultimate humiliation. The grandmother, still floating, watched everything, her eyes emotionless, a silent testament to the sea's relentless justice. The great white, with a slow and majestic movement, opened its mouth a little wider, revealing the dark throat, the abyss that awaited him. Nature, in its purest and most brutal form, was about to complete its work. The young man was just a toy, a meal, a mistake that would be corrected by the ocean. He felt the suction of the water, the predator's final movement. The end was here. The suction of the water, which the young man felt, was not just the force of the current, but the predator's very breath, the vacuum created by the opening of an abyssal jaw. There was no time to scream, nor for a last coherent thought. The darkness of the shark's eyes was the last thing he saw, a bottomless pit that reflected his own terror. And then, the impact. It was not a clean, surgical bite, but a brutal collision. The blow of a moving train. The great white's massive body collided with him, not to devour immediately, but to disorient, to crush, to break the last resistance. He felt the overwhelming pressure, the air being forced from his lungs in a muffled groan. His body, already weak and mutilated, was a rag doll in the ocean's hands. He was thrown down into the dark depths, while the shark, with surprising agility for its size, spun. The water around him exploded in a vortex of bubbles and blood. The world became a blur of pain and confusion. He did not know what had been hit, only that every fiber of his being screamed in agony. What remained of his left arm, his shoulder, seemed to have been torn off again. But this time, the pain was so intense that it transcended any physical sensation, becoming pure existence, pure suffering. The grandmother, still floating a few feet away, watched with terrible clarity. She saw the crimson whirlpool form in the water. Her grandson's body tossed like a rag. Her eyes, once dry, were now fixed, unblinking, witnessing the macabre spectacle. The great white shark, in its primal fury, seemed to ignore her completely. She was a salt statue, an inert rock, while the beast focused on the bleeding flesh, on the struggling prey. There was no fear in her now, only a cold acceptance, a resignation that mingled with a pang of grim justice. The young man, amidst the underwater chaos, felt the water invade his mouth and nose. He choked, coughed, but there was no air to breathe. His eyes, burning with salt, tried to focus, but everything was a red and blue blur. He was sinking, dragged not only by gravity, but by the force of life itself, abandoning him. The pain was a fire spreading through his entire body, but strangely, it began to become distant, a background hum as darkness advanced. And then came the second attack. This time, it was not a push, but a bite that did not seek immediate death, but dismemberment, disintegration. He felt the sharp teeth pierce his flesh, not at one point but in a line, tearing, ripping. A silent scream escaped his throat, a sound only he could hear in his dying mind. The shark did not swallow him whole. It shook him, like a dog shakes a toy, with a force that dislocated bones and tore muscles. The world spun again, and he felt the separation, the loss of another part of himself. The water around him became dense with his own blood, a scarlet cloud spreading in the blue immensity. He was the ink, the ocean, the canvas. Fragments of his life passed through his mind, distorted images of luxury and cruelty, of empty laughter and looks of contempt. And the image of his grandmother, always there, a ghost in his consciousness, now a living witness to his end. Regret, which had once been a slow poison, was now a quick poison, burning his last brain cells. The great white, with a majestic and indifferent movement, released its prey. The young man, now a human rag, floated for a brief instant, his mutilated body slowly spinning in the water. He was conscious, but only by a thread, a breath of life that refused to depart. He saw the shark move away slightly, its fin cutting the water's surface as if assessing its work, allowing time for the inevitable. The grandmother observed her grandson's body, now unrecognizable, adrift. She saw the great white circle again, not in a hurry, but with the certainty of one who has all the time in the world. Nature was not in a hurry. The ocean's justice was slow, but relentless. Her eyes, which had seen so much, now saw the end of a lineage, the price of a life of disrespect and cruelty. She felt no pity. She felt the coldness of fate, the inevitability of karma. The young man, in his last moments of consciousness, felt the cold water invade his chest, the salt burn in his open wounds. He felt the weight of the darkness pulling him down into the abyss. There was no more pain, only a growing emptiness, a strange peace that came with the acceptance of death. His eyes closed, and the last image that formed in his mind was that of his grandmother, floating, untouched, a beacon of a life he had tried to extinguish, but which the ocean had, somehow, protected. The great white, with a final, powerful and decisive movement, plunged. There were no more games, only the consummation. The young man felt the suction one last time, the final embrace of the depths, the end of everything. The ocean, relentless and just, had collected its debt, and silence fell over the waters, which now carried only the echo of a wasted life and the mute testimony of a grandmother. The silence broke the fury. It was not a silence of peace, but a heavy void, the absence of screams, of struggle, of life. The waters, once agitated by a crimson frenzy, now calmed, as if the ocean itself was digesting what had just happened. The cloud of blood slowly dispersed, a pink stain dissolving into the blue immensity, carrying with it the last vestiges of an existence that had extinguished itself in despair. The grandmother, still floating a few feet from where her grandson had disappeared, remained motionless. Her eyes, which had witnessed the barbarity, registered neither relief nor triumph, only a cold acceptance, the realization that the cycle was complete. The great white, the terrible majesty that had executed the sentence, did not linger. With a slow, powerful flick of its tail, it glided into the depths, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. There was no last glance at the elderly woman, no indication that she even existed. She was, as before, an inert part of the marine landscape, a piece of debris that the alpha predator did not deem worthy of attention. The scorching sun, which had once seemed a silent accomplice to her grandson's cruelty, now became a relentless enemy. Its rays fell mercilessly on the grandmother's wrinkled skin, burning, dehydrating. The ropes, which had once seemed an instrument of torture, were now just a constant reminder of her helplessness. They tightened around her wrists and ankles, preventing any significant movement, transforming her into a human buoy adrift. Thirst began to manifest, an itch in her throat that quickly turned into a burning sensation. The sea salt, which had once been just a taste, was now a constant presence, irritating her parched lips and exposed skin. She looked at the horizon, an indistinct line that merged with the sky, with no promise of land, no sign of salvation. The vastness of the ocean, which had once been a stage for vengeance, now revealed itself in its purest, most terrifying indifference. There were no more blue sharks. They had been scared away by the great white's presence, or perhaps by the very violence of the attack. The sea was strangely empty, a blue desert where only she, bound and adrift, existed. Solitude was a weight heavier than the water, an oppression that threatened to crush her spirit. She closed her eyes for an instant, feeling the gentle sway of the waves. Images of her life passed through her mind, not the recent ones, full of pain and contempt, but the old ones. Her husband's face, her son's laughter, the smell of wet earth in her garden. Memories of a simple, honest life that had been stolen by the ambition and cruelty of a new generation. There was no bitterness in these memories, only a deep melancholy, the awareness that everything she had built had been undone. Time became a fluid entity, without beginning or end. Minutes dragged like hours, hours like days. Exhaustion began to take over her body, but her mind remained strangely lucid. She refused to give in. She had survived her grandson's attack, the shark's fury. It would not be the sun or thirst that would take her now. A primal force, a will to live that she didn't even know she possessed, began to bubble within her. She tried to move her wrists, feeling the friction of the ropes on her skin. There was no way to free herself. The bindings were firm, tightened with the intention of ensuring her death. But hope, a small, stubborn flame, ignited. If the shark had ignored her, if the ocean had spared her immediate death, perhaps there was a purpose. Perhaps she was not there to die, but to witness, to survive. With each wave that rocked her, she felt the fragility of her existence, but also the resilience of her spirit. She was a rock, yes, but a rock that refused to sink. The salt entered her wounds, but she barely felt the pain. The greater pain, that of a heart broken by betrayal, had been washed away by the sea, replaced by a cold determination. She opened her eyes again, fixing her gaze on the horizon. There was nothing, only the blue vastness, the blue sky, the white sun. But somewhere there was land, somewhere there was life, and she somehow needed to get there. The idea of being rescued, of returning to civilization seemed distant, almost unreal. But the idea of simply giving up, of surrendering to death, was even more repugnant. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The air grew cooler, but the threat of night brought with it other fears. What did the ocean hold in the shadows? What would come with the darkness? She had been spared the great white, but the sea was a graveyard of predators, of invisible dangers. The grandmother felt a chill, not just from the night air, but from the overwhelming solitude. She was alone, completely alone, in the middle of nowhere. But somehow, this solitude was also a liberation. There was no one left to hurt her, to betray her, just her and the ocean. And for a brief moment, she felt a strange connection to the immensity that surrounded her. The sea had taken her tormentor, and now held her in its cold, indifferent embrace. She was part of it now, a small particle in its vastness, at the mercy of its currents and its secrets. Night fell completely, and the stars began to appear, thousands of points of light in a dark veil. They seemed as close, as indifferent as the ocean itself. The grandmother closed her eyes once more, not to sleep, but to conserve energy, to prepare for what was to come. The fight for survival had only just begun. The ocean had collected its debt, but hers was still outstanding. And she, the bound old woman, was willing to pay the price or to make the ocean pay hers. Night descended like a heavy cloak, not just darkening the world, but engulfing it completely. The last sparks of light were gone, and the ocean, once a vibrant blue, transformed into an indistinct abyss of ebony. The stars, which during the day had seemed distant and indifferent, now shone with a cold, cruel intensity, like the eyes of a universe that watched her without judgment, without pity. The air, which hours earlier had been a merciless furnace, now brought a biting cold, a chilling embrace that penetrated her wrinkled skin and tired bones. The grandmother felt the cold water invade her clothes. Each wave that rocked her was a chilling reminder of her vulnerability. Her muscles, already exhausted from the day's tension, began to tremble uncontrollably. Hypothermia was a silent enemy, as lethal as any predator, and she felt her fingers and toes go numb, circulation slowly diminishing. She tried to move her shoulders, her hips, any part of her body that the ropes allowed, hoping to generate some warmth, but it was useless. She was a human buoy, at the mercy of the currents and the ocean's relentless temperature. Thirst, already a torture, intensified with the cold. Her throat was dry, rough, like sandpaper. Each breath was an effort, and the salty air seemed only to aggravate the burning. She thought of rain, of a glass of fresh water, of anything that could relieve that agony. But there was nothing, only the salty vastness that surrounded her, a cruel irony for one dying of thirst. The sounds of the night on the ocean were different from those of the day. The distant murmur of larger waves, the crackle and groan of water against her body, the whistle of the wind that seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and occasionally a more disturbing sound, a splash or a subtle movement in the depths, which made her mind, already fragile, imagine dark and menacing shapes. The great white had left, but the ocean was a realm of mysteries, and she knew she was not alone. Solitude, which had once been a liberation, now became an overwhelming burden. There was no one to talk to, no one to share the burden, no one to cry out for help. Just her and the immensity. Her mind began to wander, revisiting memories, some sweet, others bitter. She saw her son's face as a child, eyes full of an innocence that time and wealth had corrupted. She saw herself, young and full of hope, building a life with her husband, brick by brick, value by value. And then, the shadow of her grandson, the greed, the cruelty that had destroyed everything. But strangely, there was no more anger. The anger had been consumed by the day's fire, by the sight of justice being served. What remained was a deep sadness, a melancholy for what had been lost, for what the family had become, and behind that, a stubborn flame of determination. She had survived everything. She would not die there, alone, in the middle of nowhere. She began to test the ropes again, with a new urgency. Her wrists and ankles were raw, skin chafed by constant friction. The salt entered the wounds, causing sharp pain, but she ignored it. Every movement was an effort. Every attempt to loosen a knot was a challenge to her dwindling strength. She knew it was almost impossible, but the idea of giving up was even more unbearable. Time stretched and shrank, an elastic and cruel entity. She did not know if hours or just minutes passed between one wave and another. Fatigue was overwhelming and her eyes were heavy, but she refused to sleep. Sleep, she knew, could be the prelude to death, the moment her body would succumb to the cold and exhaustion. She needed to remain conscious, to fight against the darkness that threatened to engulf her. Suddenly, a different sound. It was not the ocean. It was a click, a metallic creak, faint, almost imperceptible, but there, she forced her eyes open, trying to penetrate the darkness. Nothing, just the black vastness. She waited tense, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound repeated, a little louder this time, and seemed to come from afar, from some indeterminate direction. It was a sound that did not belong to the sea, a sound that spoke of civilization, of machines, of hope. Or was it just her mind, desperate for a sign, creating illusions? She could not be sure. The darkness was treacherous, and the human mind, when under extreme pressure, could play cruel tricks. But the possibility, however remote, lit a small spark in her chest. She was not completely alone. There was something out there. She tried to scream, but her voice was just a hoarse whisper, swallowed by the wind and the waves. Her throat hurt intensely. She needed to conserve her energy. If there was something out there, she would need to be ready. The night continued its slow march. The cold intensified, and she felt her limbs becoming increasingly numb. The battle now was against her own body, which cried out for rest, for warmth, for water. But her mind, strengthened by a resilience she didn't even know she possessed, refused to give in. She was the last of her lineage, the witness to a tragedy, and perhaps the only one to carry the memory of a life worth living. As the hours dragged on, the metallic sound did not repeat. The hope that had quickly emerged began to wither, replaced by the harsh reality of solitude. Perhaps it was just the wind or a piece of floating debris. The ocean was a master at deception, at creating mirages of salvation. But the grandmother did not allow herself to fall into despair. She had seen evil punished. She had felt the predator's indifference. She had faced the vastness of the sea, and she was still there. With each sway of the waves, she felt the fragility of her existence, but also the unbreakable strength of her spirit. She was a rock, yes, but a rock that refused to sink. The salt entered her wounds, but she barely felt the pain. The greater pain, that of a heart broken by betrayal, had been washed away by the sea, replaced by a cold determination. She fixed her gaze on the point where the sky and the sea met, waiting for the first sign of dawn. The night was long, but not eternal. And with the sun, perhaps a new chance, a new hope would come. She did not know what the day would bring, but she knew she would face it. She had survived the night, and that in itself was a victory. The fight for survival had only just begun, and she was ready for the next round. The ocean had collected its debt, but hers was still outstanding, and she, the bound old woman, was willing to pay the price, or to make the ocean pay hers. The night, which had seemed eternal, began to yield. There was no abrupt dawn, but a slow, almost imperceptible transition, where the ebony of the sky diluted into a deep grey, and the stars, one by one, were swallowed by the approaching light. The grandmother felt the change before she saw it. The biting cold of dawn gave way to slightly less frigid air, and a faint strip of light appeared on the eastern horizon, a silver thread promising the sun's return. She forced her eyes open, eyelids heavy and swollen, and observed the dark magic of twilight. With the light came clarity, and with clarity, a new wave of pain and reality. Her limbs were numb, her fingers and toes swollen and without sensation. The ropes had cut deeply into her skin, and the wounds, exposed to salt water all night, burned with searing intensity. The salt, a relentless enemy, had turned every scratch into an open sore, and the slightest movement caused an agony that made her hold her breath. Thirst was a constant torture, her throat dry and rough, her tongue swollen. She felt her body dehydrated, every cell crying out for fresh water, a resource that seemed more distant than the stars now disappearing. But with the light also came a renewed determination. She had survived the night. She had faced the cold, the darkness, the solitude, and the fear of the unknown. And now, the sun was returning. The sun, which had once punished her with its relentless heat, now seemed an ally, a promise of warmth and visibility. She fixed her gaze on the horizon, where the sun began to paint the sky with shades of pink and gold. The blue vastness of the ocean revealed itself again, as indifferent and imposing as before, but now, at least, visible. She began to test the ropes again, with renewed urgency. The pain was excruciating, but she used it as fuel. Every movement, however small, was a declaration of war against her captivity. Her wrists and ankles were raw, blood mixing with the salt water, but she ignored the sight. She needed to break free. She needed to. The idea of dying there, tied up like an animal, was unacceptable. She tried to bite the ropes, but her jaw strength was insufficient, and the salty, fibrous taste of the rope was repugnant. Then she remembered something. The metallic click. The sound that had appeared and disappeared in the darkness of the night. Her mind, despite exhaustion, was sharp. It was not an illusion. She was sure. There was something out there, something that did not belong to the ocean, a sign, a hope. She lifted her head, turning it slowly, sweeping the horizon with her eyes. The sun, now higher, created a dazzling glare on the water's surface, making it difficult to see. But she persisted, forcing her eyes to penetrate the veil of light. Nothing. Only the blue vastness, dotted with small waves dancing in the wind. Hope began to wither again, a deflated balloon in her chest. Was it just a mistake, a mirage of a desperate mind? Suddenly a flash, distant, almost imperceptible, but there. A silvery glint that broke the monotony of the blue. She blinked, trying to focus. It was small, very small, and seemed to dance with the waves, sometimes disappearing, sometimes reappearing. It was not a bird, it was not a fish. It was something solid, something that reflected the sunlight in an artificial way. The grandmother's heart leaped, a strong and painful beat in her chest. Was it the sound? Was it the object that caused the metallic sound? She could not be sure. The distance was immense, and her vision, blurred by fatigue and dehydration, but the possibility, however remote, ignited a new flame in her spirit. She tried to scream again, but her voice was a mere hoarse whisper, swallowed by the vast silence of the ocean. She needed something more, something to attract attention. She looked at the ropes, at her raw wrists. The pain was a constant reminder of her imprisonment, but perhaps pain could be her ally. With cold determination, she began to rub one of her wrists against the rope that tied her arm to her body, not to loosen the knot, but to further abrade the skin, to make the wound bleed more intensely. The blood, she thought, the blood could be seen. It could be a sign, a trail. The pain was excruciating, an electric shock that ran through her body. She gritted her teeth, a groan escaping her cracked lips. Blood began to flow, a dark line mixing with the salt water. She continued, ignoring the agony, focusing on the small, distant glint. If it was a boat, if it was a sign of life, they would need to see her. But the ocean, as always, guarded its own secrets. As she struggled, a dark, elongated shadow passed beneath her, swift and silent. It was not the great white. It was smaller, more agile, but equally predatory. A hammerhead shark, attracted by the smell of fresh blood spreading in the water. It circled once, twice, a menacing silhouette in the blue-green gloom. The grandmother felt a chill that was not from the cold, but from primal terror. She had been spared the great predator, but the sea was a graveyard of monsters, and she, once again, was the bait. The small glint on the horizon seemed unattainable, a cruel mirage amidst a new threat. She was between a rock and a hard place, between distant hope and immediate danger. The hammerhead shark moved closer, its dorsal fins almost touching the surface. Its eyes, small and black, seemed fixed on her. The fight for survival had only just begun, and the ocean once again was ready to collect its debt. The hammerhead shark, a dark, elongated shadow, gliding beneath the surface with lethal grace. It was not the colossal monster from before, the great white that had inexplicably spared her life, but a different threat, more agile, more persistent. It circled, a predator driven by instinct, drawn by the metallic sweet scent spreading in the water, the scent of her own blood, which she had intentionally spilled in the hope of being seen. A cruel irony, a despair that turned against her. The grandmother felt a chill, not from the cold that still lingered in the morning air, but from the primal terror that froze her bones. Her eyes, blurred by fatigue and dehydration, fixed on the silhouette moving beneath her. The dorsal fins, sharp as blades, cut the water's surface in slow, deliberate movements. It was not attacking. Not yet. It was assessing, testing, like a hunting dog sniffing its prey. Thirst was a constant torture, her throat raw, every breath an effort. But now thirst was secondary to the imminent threat. She tried to shrink, to make herself smaller, less visible, but the ropes held her stretched out, a living offering to the ocean's voracity. Her wrists and ankles burned, the open wounds pulsed with pain, and blood continued to flow, an invisible trail guiding the predator. The hammerhead shark moved closer, so close she could see the rough texture of its skin, the peculiar shape of its head that gave it its name. Its eyes, small and black, seemed fixed on her, without emotion, without pity. It was just hunger, the raw instinct of survival. She could feel the water pressure as it passed, a subtle vibration that ran through her numb body. The grandmother's mind, though exhausted, worked feverishly. She had survived the great white, the night, the cold, the solitude. She could not give in now, not to a hammerhead shark. But what to do? She was bound, defenseless, bleeding. The only thing she had was her voice, and it was a hoarse whisper. She tried to scream again, a guttural sound that barely scraped her throat. The shark did not react, just continued its relentless circle. It was as if she did not exist, just a piece of meat floating, waiting for the right moment to be consumed. The helplessness was overwhelming. Her eyes turned back to the distant glint on the horizon. It was still there, a silver point dancing with the waves, a mirage of hope amidst the blue hell. Was it a boat, a ship, or just some debris reflecting the sun? The distance seemed not to shrink, and the threat beneath her became increasingly real. The hammerhead shark, in one of its circles, passed beneath her, and with a quick and unexpected movement, brushed against her body. It was not an attack, but a test, an exploratory touch. The grandmother felt the roughness of the shark's skin against her back, a shiver of dread that made her hold her breath. The smell of the sea mixed with the smell of fish, a strong, wild odor. She closed her eyes for an instant, gathering strength. No, she thought, I will not die like this, not after everything. The image of her grandson, his face distorted by hatred and cruelty, flashed through her mind. She had survived him, and she would survive this too. With renewed determination, she began to struggle as much as the ropes allowed. It was not a movement to free herself, but to create turbulence in the water, to appear less like easy prey, more like a threat. The pain in her wrists and ankles was searing, but she ignored it. Every movement was a declaration of her will to live. The hammerhead shark stopped its circles, watching her. Its peculiar head, with eyes at the ends, seemed to study her every move. It did not move away. It just stayed there, a few feet away, an immobile and menacing silhouette. The tension was palpable, the air heavy with anticipation. The sun, now higher, beat down on the water's surface, creating a dazzling glare that made it difficult to see beyond the shark. But she continued to look at the horizon, at that silver point. If it was a boat, they would need to see her. They would. She thought of one more thing. The bait. The bait her grandson had tied to her. It was still there, attached to the ropes on her body. They were pieces of fish, already half decomposed, but still with a strong smell. The great white had ignored them, but what about the hammerhead shark? With a Herculean effort, she tried to move one of her arms, rubbing it against one of the baits. The idea was to loosen it, or at least to make the smell spread even further, perhaps attracting the shark to the bait and not to her. The pain was excruciating, but she persisted. Then, with an agonizing tug, a piece of the bait broke free and floated away from her. The hammerhead shark, which had been watching, reacted instantly. With a swift movement, it lunged at the piece of fish, snapping it up and disappearing for a brief moment into the depths. The grandmother seized the distraction. She didn't know how much time she had, but it was a chance. She began to struggle again, using all her remaining strength to try and loosen the ropes. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she forced them. The skin on her wrists was raw, blood flowing freely, but she did not stop. The hammerhead shark reappeared, but now it seemed more interested in the pieces of bait still attached to her. It circled again, but this time its movements were faster, more focused on the fish pieces. It was hungry, and the bait was easier to catch than she who was struggling. A new wave of hope, fragile as a spider's web, arose in her chest. If she could release all the bait, perhaps the shark would focus on them and leave her alone. But the bait was tightly tied, and her strength was rapidly ebbing. As she struggled, a distant sound, faint but unmistakable, reached her ears. It was not the metallic click of the night, but a deep, continuous hum, and it seemed to be coming from the glint on the horizon. The grandmother's heart leaped. It was the sound of an engine, a boat engine. Hope, which had been just a spark, now transformed into a burning flame. She was not alone. There was someone out there, and they were coming. But the hammerhead shark was still there, an immediate threat, and the sun continued to beat down on her, draining her last strength. The fight for survival was far from over, but now she had a reason to continue. She had a sound, a promise, and she would not give up. The hum. That distant, deep, continuous sound was the sweetest melody she had ever heard in her life. It was not the metallic clang of her grandson's boat, nor the oppressive silence of the ocean. It was the sound of an engine, a boat engine, and it seemed to be coming from the silvery glint on the horizon. A promise, a chance. Hope, which had been only a dying spark, now transformed into a burning flame, scorching through exhaustion and pain. The hammerhead shark, however, was still a cold and menacing reality. It had lunged at the piece of bait she had managed to free, and now circled with renewed energy, its movements faster, more focused on the other pieces of fish still tied to her body. Its eyes, at the ends of its peculiar head, seemed fixed on the bait, not on her. It was a distraction, a temporary truce, but she knew it wouldn't last. The ocean's hunger was insatiable, and she, despite everything, was still prey. The grandmother's throat was raw, each breath an agonizing effort, but she forced air out, trying to scream again. A hoarse, weak sound escaped, swallowed by the vastness of the sea. It was not enough. She needed more, needed to be seen, to be heard. The sound of the engine, though closer, still seemed an eternity away. With a determination bordering on madness, she began to struggle again. Not to free herself, the ropes were too tight, the skin on her wrists and ankles raw, blood flowing freely. But to create turbulence in the water, to appear less like a piece of drifting meat, more like a living entity, fighting. Every movement was a declaration of her will to live, an affront to the death that surrounded her. The pain was searing, an electric shock that ran through her body, but she embraced it. The pain was a reminder that she was still alive, still fighting. The hammerhead shark stopped its circles for an instant, watching her. Its head, with its distant eyes, seemed to study her frantic movements. It did not move away, just stayed there, a few feet away, an immobile and menacing silhouette. The tension was palpable, the air heavy with anticipation. The sun, now higher, beat down on the water's surface, creating a dazzling glare that made it difficult to see beyond the shark. But she continued to look at the horizon, at that silvery point that now seemed to have grown slightly. She thought of her grandson. The image of his face, distorted by hatred and cruelty, flashed through her mind. The one who had thrown her there to die. Anger, a powerful and unexpected emotion, gave her a new surge of strength. She would not die like this. Not because of him. She would survive. She had to survive. With an agonizing tug, she tried to move one of her arms again, rubbing it against another piece of bait tied to the ropes. The idea was to loosen it, or at least to make the smell spread even further, perhaps attracting the shark to the bait and not to her. The skin on her fingers was rough. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she persisted. Finally, with a wet snap, another piece of fish broke free and floated away from her. The hammerhead shark reacted instantly. With a swift movement, it lunged at the piece of fish, snapping it up and disappearing for a brief moment into the depths. The grandmother seized the distraction. She didn't know how much time she had, but it was a chance. She began to struggle again, using all her remaining strength to try and loosen the ropes. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she forced them. The skin on her wrists was raw, blood flowing freely, but she did not stop. The sound of the engine, it was louder now. The deep hum was transforming into a distant yet unmistakable roar. The silvery point on the horizon had turned into a silhouette, still indistinct, but definitely larger. A boat. It was a boat. Tears of relief and exhaustion mingled with the salt water on her face. She was not alone. There was someone out there, and they were coming. But the hammerhead shark, in its feeding frenzy, made an unexpected move. It did not lunge at the bait, but at the rope that held one of the pieces of fish to her ankle. With a violent tug, the rope snapped, and the piece of bait was torn off. The grandmother felt a shock, not of pain, but of dread. The shark was too close, its sharp teeth mere inches from her flesh. Its black, emotionless eyes seemed to bore into her. She screamed, a hoarse, desperate sound that this time seemed to have a little more strength. She struggled with all her might, ignoring the searing pain in her limbs. The boat was closer. She could make out the shape of the hull now, a dark smudge against the sun's glare. She needed to be seen. She needed to. With a final effort, she lifted her head as high as she could, trying to make as much noise and movement as possible. The hammerhead shark, seemingly irritated by her agitation, made a tighter circle, its fins almost brushing her back. The smell of fish and blood was overwhelming. She closed her eyes for a second, terror chilling her veins. Then the sound, not the engine, but a horn. A sharp, prolonged blast that cut through the air and the sea. They saw her. They saw her. The grandmother's heart leapt, an explosion of adrenaline that made her open her eyes. The boat was approaching rapidly, and she could distinguish figures on the deck. But the hammerhead shark, startled by the sudden sound, made an abrupt movement. It turned, and with a powerful flick of its tail, struck the grandmother on her side. The pain was excruciating, a shock that left her breathless, and her head was submerged in the salt water. She swallowed water, coughed, struggled to breathe, as darkness began to invade her vision. The boat was there, the horn sounded again, but the ocean once more tried to claim her. The salt water invaded her mouth and nose, burning her airways. The impact of the hammerhead shark's tail had been brutal, knocking the air from her lungs and throwing her down into the cold darkness. Her eyes, burning, tried to open, but her vision was blurry, full of bubbles and dancing shadows. The sound of the horn, once a melody of hope, now seemed a distant echo, muffled by the ocean's pressure. She struggled, an instinctive and desperate movement, but her body was heavy, exhausted, the ropes tightening around her like a shroud. Darkness began to close in on her, a grey mist invading her mind. Was this the end? After everything, all the struggle, would the ocean finally claim her? But then, a hand. A strong, firm hand grabbed her arm, pulling her with surprising force to the surface. Air. She gasped, coughed, choked, expelling the salt water as her lungs filled with oxygen. The sunlight, once blinding, now felt like a warm embrace. She was alive. Someone had reached her. Above her, voices, shouts of relief, of urgency. She could barely distinguish the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were there. A man, his face etched with worry, held her arm firmly, while another tried to untie the ropes that bound her to the bait. The boat was a few feet away, a sturdy white hull, and more people crowded the edge, reaching out to help her. The hammerhead shark, however, had not disappeared. Agitated by the commotion, it circled frantically, its fins cutting the water's surface in erratic movements. Its eyes, at the ends of its peculiar head, seemed fixed on the bait still attached to the grandmother's body and on the blood flowing from her wrists and ankles. The threat was palpable, a chilling reminder that she was not yet safe. In her grandson's boat, the scene was one of pure chaos. The young man, in a frenzy of panic and fury, watched his grandmother's imminent rescue. His meticulously orchestrated plan was crumbling before his eyes. The blood from his arm, which he had cut the night before in a fit of rage, and which now flowed freely, formed small puddles on the boat's deck, mixing with the splashing seawater. The smell, once imperceptible to him, now seemed amplified by the sun's heat and the ocean's proximity. He screamed, a hoarse voice distorted by despair, trying to attract the attention of the rescue boat's crew, perhaps to invent a story, to prevent them from pulling her out of the water. But his words were swallowed by the roar of the engine and the shouts of her rescuers. The rage, which had been the fuel of his cruelty, now transformed into a chilling terror. He could not allow her to be rescued, not after everything. As the grandmother was pulled with difficulty from the water, one of the men struggling to cut the last ropes, a gigantic, dark shadow emerged from the depths. It was not the hammerhead shark, which abruptly moved away, as if fearing the new presence. This shadow was larger, more massive, moving with lethal and silent grace. A strange silence fell over the water, an eerie premonition. The grandmother's eyes, still blurry, caught a glimpse. A colossal grey shape, with a dorsal fin that looked like a torn sail. A great white shark, the true predator, the monster of the depths that her grandson had hoped would devour her. Her heart froze. She was inches from safety, but death, in its most primordial form, was there. The great white shark circled once, slowly, its black, emotionless eyes passing by her, ignoring her completely. It was as if she did not exist, a piece of debris in the vast ocean. Its attention was focused elsewhere, on the boat, on the smell. Her grandson, still shouting obscenities, was now standing on the deck, his bleeding arm exposed to the sun. The smell of his own blood, mixed with the scent of the bait he had used to attract his grandmother's death, was an irresistible beacon for the beast. The great white shark accelerated, not towards the grandmother, but in an elegant and deadly arc towards the boat. A warning cry echoed from the rescue boat. "Look out! Shark!" The rich young man, in his delirium of rage and panic, barely had time to register the warning. He turned, his eyes widening in terror as he saw the imposing grey mass rapidly approaching. The water around the boat bubbled. With surprising speed, the great white shark leaped out of the water, a terrifying vision of sharp teeth and pure brute force. It was not a leap to attack the grandmother, nor to capsize the boat. It was a precise, targeted leap. The gigantic jaws closed with a deafening snap, not on the grandmother, but on her grandson's outstretched arm, the arm that was bleeding. The young man's scream was abruptly cut short, transforming into a howl of pain and absolute horror as the shark, with a violent tug, tore the limb from his body. Blood gushed, staining the boat's deck a dark, vibrant red, and the great white shark, with its macabre prize, plunged back into the depths, leaving behind a trail of chaos and a deafening silence. The grandmother, now almost completely out of the water, looked at the boat. Her grandson lay fallen, writhing in agony, his left arm now an open, bleeding wound. The sea, which he had used as an instrument of his cruelty, had turned against him. Justice, in a brutal and unexpected way, had arrived, but the scene of horror was far from over. The smell of fresh blood in the air was an invitation to other predators, and the grandmother, though almost safe, still felt the cold of the ocean on her skin, the echo of death in her ears. The young man's howl, a primal sound of pain and horror, was the last thing the grandmother heard clearly before being pulled from the water. Her body, heavy and sore, finally yielded to the force of the hands that lifted her. She was thrown, rather than placed, onto the deck of the rescue boat, a tangle of ropes, bruised flesh, and exhaustion. Her lungs burned with the fresh air, and her eyes, still blurred by salt water and shock, fixed on the drifting boat. There he was, her grandson, fallen to his knees, writhing in agony. His left arm, where it should have been, was now an open, pulsating wound, gushing blood at an alarming rate. The boat's deck, previously merely wet, was rapidly transforming into a scarlet pool, a macabre mirror of the horror that had just unfolded. The smell. Ah, the smell. The sweet, metallic aroma of fresh blood mixed with ocean salt and the stench of fish invaded her nostrils, a fragrance of death that seemed to permeate everything. On the rescue boat, chaos was palpable. The men who had pulled her out were in shock, their faces pale and their eyes wide, fixed on the scene in the boat. One of them, the same one who had held her arm, let out a hoarse cry. "My God, he tore off his arm!" The voice was laden with disbelief and terror. Another ran to the cabin, likely to call for help, while a third, more experienced, grabbed a radio, his voice tense and urgent as he reported the incident. The grandmother, lying on the rough deck, felt pain in every fiber of her being, but it was a secondary pain. The shock, the adrenaline, the sight of her dismembered grandson all kept her in a state of stupor. She couldn't look away. Justice, so brutal and unexpected, had manifested in a way she could never have imagined, even in her worst nightmares. The monster he had invoked to devour her had turned against him. The great white shark had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the blood trail and the terrifying image of its strength. But the danger had not dissipated. The smell of fresh blood, abundant and irresistible, was a beacon for all ocean predators. The hammerhead shark, which had pursued her earlier, reappeared, circling at a respectful distance from the boat, but its movements were faster, more frantic. It was not alone. Dark shadows began to emerge from the depths, drawn by the unexpected feast. "We have to get out of here, now!" one of the men shouted, his voice echoing with panic. The rescue boat's engine roared, coming to life with renewed urgency. As the boat began to pull away, the grandmother could still see her grandson. He had fainted, his body inert on the red deck, life draining from him in a constant flow. No one on the rescue boat made any move to help him. The shock was too great, the threat too present. The priority was survival, and he, the villain, had become an even bigger bait than she. The boat accelerated, cutting through the waves with force, leaving behind the small boat and its dying passenger. The grandmother, with immense effort, managed to sit up, leaning against the boat's side. Every movement was torture, but she needed to see, needed to witness the end of that cruelty. The boat shrank in the distance, a dark and solitary smudge, surrounded by a sea that boiled with the promise of more blood. She saw the fins, several of them, cutting the water's surface in a voracious frenzy. The hammerhead shark, now accompanied by others of its kind, and perhaps by something even larger, was lunging at the boat. There were no more screams from her grandson, only the silence of the ocean, punctuated by the roar of the rescue boat's engine. The tears, once of relief, were now a complex mixture of horror, exhaustion, and a strange, almost guilty sense of justice. She had survived. Against all odds, against the cruelty of her own blood, she had been spared. But the price had been paid in a way no one could have predicted. The men on the rescue boat, though relieved to be moving away from immediate danger, were in a state of profound shock. One of them, the same one who had pulled her out, covered her with an emergency blanket, his eyes still fixed on the horizon, where the boat and her grandson's fate faded from view. "You're safe now, Grandma," he said, his voice choked. "You're safe." Jadatul. But the grandmother knew that safety was a fragile illusion. The ocean had shown its wildest face, and nature, in its brutal indifference, had collected its debt. She was alive, yes, but the image of the torn arm, the smell of blood, and the frenzy of the sharks would be etched in her memory forever. The sun, which had once seemed a symbol of hope, now cast a cruel glare on the waves, reminding her of the darkness hidden beneath the surface. The nightmare had ended, but its scars, visible and invisible, were only just beginning to form. She looked at the open sea, which had almost devoured her, and which had now devoured her tormentor. The silence that followed the roar of the sharks was more terrifying than any scream. The journey back would be long, and the path to recovery even longer. But she was alive, and that in itself was a miracle. The roar of the rescue boat's engine, once a sound of salvation, now seemed a distant lament, muffling the echoes of the horror we left behind. The smell of blood, though the wind quickly carried it away, still seemed to permeate my nostrils, a persistent reminder of the macabre feast the ocean had prepared. I lay on the deck, the rough emergency blanket against my wet, cold skin, but the cold I felt came from within, a chill no blanket could dissipate. The rescue men, once hurried heroes, now moved with a silent gravity. Their faces, once pale with shock, began to compose themselves, but their eyes still carried the image of what they had witnessed. One of them, the same one who had pulled me from the water, sat beside me, offering a bottle of water. His hand trembled slightly as he handed it to me. "You're safe now, Grandma," he repeated, his voice hoarse, as if trying to convince himself as much as me. I merely nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with a mixture of salt, exhaustion, and a pain that went beyond the physical. The boat cut through the waves, moving further and further away from that point on the horizon, where the scarlet stain in the sea mingled with the darkness of the fins. I didn't need to look to know what was happening. Nature, in its brutal indifference, was cleaning up the mess. The monster my grandson had invoked to devour me had turned against him, and now the other predators of the abyss finished the work. It was a wild, primal justice that made no distinction between victim and tormentor, only responded to the call of blood. As the lights of the coast began to appear as twinkling dots in the distance, my mind wandered. The image of the torn arm, the cut-off scream, the inert body in the red boat, it all repeated in a cruel loop. I had survived, but at what cost? At what price had life been spared? There was no triumph in my survival, only a profound weariness, and the certainty that something within me had been irremediably broken. The journey back seemed to last an eternity. The sun, which had witnessed my near death and my grandson's death, now set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, as if the sky itself were bleeding. Each wave that hit the boat's hull was a reminder of the ocean's relentless power, a power I had underestimated and that my grandson had tried to manipulate for his own wicked ends. He had gambled with death, and death had exacted a price he never imagined paying. When we finally reached the port, a small crowd was already waiting. Ambulance sirens and police car lights tore through the night's silence. I was wrapped in warmer blankets and worried faces leaned over me. Questions were asked, but my answers were monosyllables, fragments of a reality that seemed too surreal to tell. I was taken to an ambulance, the warmth of the heater and the smell of antiseptic, a stark contrast to the cold saltiness of the sea. In the hospital I was examined, treated for hypothermia and the countless abrasions and cuts that covered my body. The physical pain was real, but the pain that had settled in my soul was much deeper. I was alive, yes, but the woman who had been tied up and thrown into the sea was not the same one who now lay in a hospital bed. She had died out there, in the blue immensity, and a new version, scarred and haunted, had returned. The days that followed were a blur of testimonies, doctors, and attempts to process the unthinkable. The stories spread like wildfire, the media hungry for every detail of the tragedy and the wild justice. But for me, it was more than a story. It was my life, the brutal end of a lineage, proof that cruelty sooner or later finds its own end. The physical scars would eventually heal, but the invisible ones, those the great white shark had etched into my memory, those would remain. The smell of fish, the sound of the waves, the sight of a fin, all of it would bring me back to that day, to that moment when life and death danced a macabre waltz. I had survived my own blood, the malice of a hardened heart, and the untamed fury of the ocean. And as I looked at the horizon, I no longer saw the promise of an end, but the vastness of a new beginning. A solitary beginning, yes, but free. Free from the shadow of cruelty, free from the shackles of the past. The sea had pushed me to the limit, but it had also returned me, a survivor, a silent witness to the justice the abyss imposed, and that, in itself, was the greatest miracle of all.